Picture a trial. Athens, 399 BC. The jury has just voted. The verdict is guilty. And somewhere in the crowd, watching the most famous philosopher in the world be condemned to death, there are people thinking about a name that has not been spoken aloud in the courtroom. The charges say corrupting the youth of Athens. Many in the room would have known which former students the charge could evoke. His name was Alcibiades. He had been dead for 5 years by the time Socrates drank the hemlock. But his shadow was in that courtroom as surely as if he had walked through the door. The most brilliant student Socrates ever taught. The most spectacular apparent failure of everything Socrates believed about the power of philosophy to change a human life. He was born into one of the greatest families in the greatest city in the ancient world. He was raised in the house of Pericles. He was educated by the man history would call the wisest person who ever lived. He was, by every account that survives across 24 centuries, one of the most physically striking human beings of his generation, and possibly of any generation Athens ever produced. He commanded fleets and lost them. He advised enemies and then betrayed them. He changed sides 3 times in the same war. He was exiled twice by the city that loved him. He was recalled twice by the city that feared losing him. And in the end he died alone in a burning house in a country that was not his own, surrounded by men who had been paid to make sure he never came home. Athens did not fully recover from what it did with him, and what he did to it. This is the complete story of Alcibiades of Athens, perhaps the most beautiful, perhaps the most dangerous man the democracy ever created. Settle in. Let the world outside go quiet. We are going back to the 5th century BC, to a city at the absolute peak of its power, and to the man who showed what that power could produce when everything went wrong at once. Chapter 1. The Golden Child. To understand Alcibiades, you have to understand what Athens was in the years of his birth. Ancient sources place his birth sometime around the middle of the 5th century BC. The precise year uncertain, with most modern scholars working from surrounding events to estimate somewhere in the early 450s. What is not uncertain is the world he was born into, and that world was Athens, at the summit of everything it had spent 2 generations building. The Persian wars were over. The fleet that had broken Xerxes at Salamis had established Athens as the dominant naval power in the Aegean. The Delian League, formed to resist Persia, had slowly transformed into something closer to an Athenian empire. The tribute flowing in from across the Aegean was funding a building program on the Acropolis that would produce the Parthenon, a structure so precisely engineered and so visually commanding that it would still draw visitors from every corner of the earth 2,500 years later. The man directing all of this was Pericles. He was the dominant political figure in Athens for 3 decades. A statesman of extraordinary intelligence and strategic patience who understood that democracy required not just institutions but cultivation, that the people who voted in the assembly needed to be educated, entertained, and given a city beautiful enough to make them proud of what they were defending. He built the Parthenon. He expanded the navy. He extended democratic participation. He transformed Athens from a powerful city into a civilization, into this world, at its most confident and most ambitious. A boy was born whose family connected him to almost everything that mattered. His father was Cleinias, from the deme of Scambonidae, a man of genuine military distinction who had fought with courage at the Battle of Coronea. The family was ancient and respected. tracing its lineage through generations of Athenian aristocracy. On his mother's side, Alcibiades was connected to the Alcmaeonid family, one of the most powerful dynasties in Athenian history, the same family that had produced Cleisthenes, the architect of Athenian democracy, the same family that had produced Pericles himself through a different branch. This was not merely privilege. This was the privilege of people who had built the city you were growing up in. Then his father died. Cleinias was killed at the Battle of Coronea when Alcibiades was very young, perhaps 3 years old. Plutarch records that Alcibiades and his younger brother Cleinias were placed under the guardianship of their mother's relative, Pericles, and his brother Ariphron. Think about what this means. A small boy loses his father in battle and is taken into the household of the most powerful man in the most powerful city in the Greek world. Pericles was not a distant guardian who managed estates and sent occasional letters. He was a man with a genuine interest in education, in the formation of character, in what Athens could produce when its best minds were applied to raising its next generation. His household was one of the intellectual centres of the city. The philosopher Anaxagoras passed through it. The sculptor Phidias worked under his patronage. The conversations that shaped Athenian thought in the 5th century BC happened in rooms where a small boy was growing up, watching how power actually looked from the inside. This was where Alcibiades learned what the world could offer someone like him. We do not have detailed records of his childhood in the way modern biography would require. We have Plutarch, working from sources that were themselves already centuries old. We have fragments from other writers, and we have the account Plato gives in the Symposium, where Alcibiades himself appears as a character and reflects with a painful honesty that has no parallel in the rest of his recorded life on what his relationship with Socrates had meant and failed to mean. What emerges from these sources is a picture of a child recognized early as extraordinary in ways that went beyond the advantages of his birth. Plutarch records multiple stories from his childhood, noting himself that such tales belong partly to the tradition of stories a city tells about its most famous figures, rather than entirely to the category of verified record. What they collectively capture is something true about the impression he made on people around him. There is the story of the wrestling match, where rather than accept defeat, he bit his opponent's hand. When the other boy accused him of biting like a woman, Alcibiades reportedly replied that he bit like a lion. There is the story of the dice game in the street, where, when a cart came through, he lay down in front of it rather than moving aside, forcing the driver to halt. There is the story of the flute teacher, whose lessons he rejected on the grounds that playing the flute distorted the face and was undignified for a free citizen. Plutarch says this last story spread through Athens. That Athenian youth began declining flute lessons because Alcibiades had declined them. That the fashion shifted because he set it. He was perhaps 10 years old. Each story shows the same pattern. A child who understood, earlier than most adults ever do, that rules are agreements, and that agreements only hold as long as both parties believe the other will enforce them. He was testing limits not randomly, but systematically, observing which limits held and which dissolved under pressure, learning, in the specific environment of Periclean Athens, that for someone with his particular combination of gifts and connections, a remarkable number of limits dissolved. This is not the same as being wicked. It is worth being precise here, because the story of Alcibiades is sometimes told as if his later choices were simply the expression of a character corrupt from birth. That reading is too simple and ultimately not very interesting. What the childhood stories suggest is something more complicated and more instructive. A child with exceptional intelligence, exceptional physical gifts, and an unusual degree of personal magnetism. Growing up in the most powerful household, in the most powerful city in the ancient world, being told by almost every experience that the constraints governing other people's lives did not quite apply to him. That belief was not entirely wrong. The constraints of Athens did not govern him the way they governed an ordinary citizen. The problem was not that he believed the rules applied differently to him. The problem was that he never developed a principle to replace the rules he was exempt from. Most people who live within ordinary constraints do not need a personal ethical framework because the constraints do their work for them. Alcibiades was free from the constraints early. And no one, not Pericles, not the household tutors, not even eventually Socrates, managed to give him something solid to put in their place. His beauty deserves its own consideration, not as a biographical detail, but as a historical factor. Athens, in the 5th century BC, had a specific and formalized relationship with physical beauty that is different from almost anything most modern readers will find immediately familiar. The Greek word kalos meant both beautiful and noble. The same word. When Athenians called something beautiful, they were also calling it good. When they called someone good, they expected them to be beautiful. Beauty in Athens was not merely aesthetic. It was understood as a sign of something deeper, an outward expression of inner excellence, a quality that carried genuine moral weight in a culture that organized its public life around the display of excellence in every form it took. Alcibiades was, by every account that survives, the most physically striking person of his generation in Athens. Plutarch describes his beauty as persisting from childhood into old age, always suited to his years, always the most immediately striking thing about him in any company he kept. Other ancient sources confirm this consistently enough that the claim belongs to the category of historical impression rather than biographical legend. Add that beauty to aristocratic lineage. Add lineage to the household of Pericles. Add all of that to an intelligence that his tutors recognized as genuine and exceptional, and you have the specific combination that made Alcibiades what he became. Not simply a talented person, not simply a privileged person, a person whose every experience from childhood onward confirmed that the ordinary limits of human life did not apply to him, and who had the gifts to make that belief seem, for a long time, entirely justified. Somewhere in Athens, in those same years, a strange barefoot man was walking through the agora, asking questions that made powerful people look foolish. His name was Socrates, and he was about to meet the child who would become the greatest challenge and the greatest sorrow of his life. Chapter 2. The Philosopher and the Boy. There is a particular kind of attention that a great mind gives to a person it recognizes as genuinely extraordinary. Not admiration. Admiration is easy and costs nothing. This is something more careful and more serious. The attention of someone who sees not just what a person is, but what a person could become, and who understands, with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable, the precise distance between those two things. Socrates gave that attention to Alcibiades. He was already known in Athens by the time they met. The strange barefoot philosopher who haunted the agora and asked questions that no one could answer satisfactorily. who claim to know nothing, who seem to find genuine pleasure in demonstrating that the most confident people in the city understood least about the things they were most confident about, generals who thought they understood courage, politicians who thought they understood justice, priests who thought they understood piety, all of them, under Socratic questioning, discovering that what they had taken for knowledge was largely inherited habit dressed in the language of conviction. Alcibiades was somewhere in his adolescence when the relationship began. The ancient sources not entirely consistent on the precise age. What is consistent is the nature of what Socrates saw when he looked at him. He pursued the boy. In a city where Socrates was famous for waiting, for sitting in the market and letting curiosity do its work, with Alcibiades he moved first. Plutarch records that Socrates recognized in him a nature that was both exceptional and genuinely at risk. The gifts were real. The danger was equally real. And Socrates, who spent his life trying to wake people from the comfortable sleep of unexamined assumptions, understood that with Alcibiades the stakes were higher than usual. A mediocre person left unexamined produces a mediocre life. An exceptional person left unexamined produces something far more consequential. To understand what happened between them, you need to understand what Socrates was actually doing when he taught. He was not transmitting information. He was not delivering lectures or testing comprehension. The Socratic method, which his student Plato would later describe across dozens of dialogues, was a form of intellectual combat conducted with complete courtesy. Socrates would approach someone, express genuine curiosity about their area of expertise, ask them to define their central concept, and then, through a series of careful questions, demonstrate that the definition did not hold, that the thing they were most confident about was the thing they understood least. The effect on most people was deflating. With Alcibiades, the dynamic was different. The boy was too intelligent to be simply deflated. He could follow the argument. He could feel the ground shifting under his assumptions and adjust his position quickly enough to stay ahead of the most obvious traps. This made him, in Socratic terms, a more interesting interlocutor than most of the generals and politicians. Socrates regularly engaged. It also made him more dangerous to himself, because intelligence without wisdom is a faster vehicle with no better steering. There is a dialogue attributed to Plato, known as Alcibiades I, that presents a conversation between Socrates and a young Alcibiades preparing to enter public life. Scholars have debated the authenticity of this dialogue for centuries. It was accepted as genuinely Platonic in antiquity and through most of the ancient world. Modern scholarship is more divided. The safest position is to treat it as reflecting concerns that appear throughout Plato's confirmed writing, as capturing something true about the dynamic between the two men, even if its specific dramatic setting cannot be taken as literal transcript. In the dialogue, Alcibiades is confident. He has every reason to be. He is about to advise Athens on matters of war and peace, justice and policy. Socrates questions him. Does he understand justice? Does he understand what is truly good for Athens, as opposed to what merely seems good? Does he understand himself? The answers dissolve under questioning. Alcibiades discovers that he has been confusing knowledge with cleverness, cleverness with wisdom, and wisdom with the ability to get what he wants. These are not the same thing. And the recognition arrives not through argument, but through questions, which is the only way Socrates ever moved anyone. To know what is truly good you must first know yourself. And to know yourself, you must be willing to examine the parts of yourself you most prefer to leave unexamined. This was the core of what Socrates was offering. Not information, not advantage, not a method for winning arguments. A discipline of honest self-examination that required, as its first condition, the willingness to discover that you were wrong about yourself. Alcibiades was drawn to Socrates in a way he was drawn to almost nothing else. This is well documented across multiple ancient sources. Plato's Symposium, set at a drinking party in 416 BC, contains a speech by Alcibiades that has no parallel in ancient literature. He is drunk. He is honest in the way that certain people are only honest when they are drunk, saying things they have known for years and have been carefully not saying. He describes Socrates as the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed. Not ashamed in the ordinary social sense. Ashamed of the gap between what he was and what he could be. Ashamed that he kept choosing the easier path over the examined one. Ashamed that he could see clearly what Socrates was pointing at, and kept turning away from it anyway. He compares Socrates to a bronze figure of Silenus, the ugly satyr of Greek mythology, that when opened reveals golden statues of gods inside. The outside ridiculous, the inside divine, and Alcibiades, who was beautiful on the outside and turbulent within, found in this inversion something that both attracted and disturbed him in ways he could not fully articulate, even in that moment of honesty. He also describes, with a candour that has made this passage famous for 2,500 years, his attempt to seduce Socrates. This passage requires honest handling. Relationships between older men and younger men that involved mentorship and sometimes physical attraction were a recognized part of aristocratic culture in 5th century Athens. Though the norms governing such relationships were debated even then, Alcibiades describes inviting Socrates to dinner, arranging to be alone with him, and finally lying down beside him, expecting Socrates to respond the way every other admirer in Athens would have responded to the most beautiful young man in the city offering himself freely. Socrates talked to him about virtue. Then he went to sleep. Alcibiades describes the morning after with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment that carries genuine humour even across the distance of translation. He had offered what everyone wanted and had been declined by the one person whose opinion he actually valued. What Socrates was doing, as best we can reconstruct it from Plato's account, was refusing to give Alcibiades what Alcibiades always received from everyone else: unconditional response to unconditional beauty. Socrates was perhaps uniquely in Athens a person who genuinely did not care what Alcibiades looked like. He cared about what Alcibiades was choosing to do with the gifts he had been given. And that was a harder thing to offer and a harder thing to receive. This refusal made Socrates more compelling to Alcibiades than anyone who had simply given him what he wanted. He kept coming back. He kept engaging. He kept putting himself within range of the questions he found both irresistible and impossible to fully answer. And then, consistently and repeatedly, he walked away. Plutarch describes Socrates as genuinely concerned by this pattern, concerned in the specific way that a person is concerned when they can see clearly what is going to happen and have no way of preventing it. The philosopher recognized the particular danger of someone who could see clearly what was right and repeatedly choose otherwise, not out of ignorance, out of preference, The ancient Greeks called this akrasia, acting against your own better judgment, choosing the worse option while knowing it is worse. He knew, he always knew, and he chose anyway. Socrates, who had reached people that everyone else had given up on, could not reach him. The failure was not a failure of effort or intelligence or genuine care. It was a failure that would eventually illuminate something important about the limits of what philosophy can accomplish when the person it is trying to reach has decided, at a level deeper than argument can access, that the examined life costs more than they are willing to pay. You cannot teach genuine self-examination to someone who has decided that self-examination is a constraint rather than a liberation. Socrates could not make the choice for him. Philosophy illuminates. It cannot compel. It is worth noting, as we move forward through this story, that Socrates never stopped believing in him. The philosopher who would eventually stand trial for corrupting the youth of Athens continued, until the very end of his life, to believe that the question he had been asking Alcibiades since adolescence was still worth asking, that the examined life was still available to anyone willing to turn and face it. He was wrong about that in the specific case, and that specific wrongness would become part of the atmosphere that later made Socrates vulnerable. The boy who had made the wisest man in Athens pursue him was about to enter a world that would give him everything he wanted. What happened to the man who had tried to show him what he actually needed is a thread we will follow all the way to the end of this story. Chapter 3. The most beautiful man in the room. There is a quality that certain people possess that is different from ordinary attractiveness and operates by different rules. It is not simply a matter of features, not symmetry or proportion or the specific arrangements that different cultures agree to call beautiful. It is something more active than that, something that involves the way a person moves through space, the quality of attention they bring to whoever they are speaking with, the particular combination of physical presence and social intelligence that makes a room reorganize itself around a person the moment they walk in. Alcibiades had this quality. Every ancient source that describes him in person describes the same effect. Rooms changed when he entered them. Conversations turned toward him. People who had intended to be indifferent found themselves watching, and the people who watched found themselves wanting, in ways they could not always articulate, to be noticed by him in return. Plutarch describes his beauty as persisting across his entire life, from childhood through old age, always suited to his years, always the most immediately striking thing about him in any company he kept. Other ancient sources confirm this consistently enough that the impression belongs to historical record rather than biographical legend. The ancient sources also consistently describe his voice as unusually compelling. There are accounts of a slight lisp that, rather than being a flaw, apparently added to the impression he made, giving his speech a quality that people found distinctive and memorable. Plutarch records that this lisp was widely imitated by people who admired him, which tells us something both about the extent of his influence and about the peculiar way that charismatic figures make even their imperfections seem like advantages worth copying. To understand why beauty mattered so much in Athens, you need to understand the specific cultural framework the Athenians used to think about physical appearance. The Greeks had a concept called kalokagathia, a compound combining kalos, meaning beautiful, and agathos, meaning good. The concept expressed a belief that physical beauty and moral excellence were not merely associated, but were in some sense expressions of the same underlying reality. A beautiful person was expected to be a good person. A person of genuine excellence was expected to manifest that excellence physically. The outer form was understood as a reliable indication of inner character. This belief had practical political consequences. In a democracy where citizens voted in assembly and evaluated candidates largely by the impression they made in person, beauty was a form of political capital. It created a presumption of trustworthiness. It made crowds more willing to listen. It made dangerous proposals seem more reasonable when they came from a face the audience associated with excellence. Alcibiades understood this intuitively. The ancient sources suggest he understood it almost as early as he understood anything, that he grasped the difference between what he actually was and what his appearance allowed people to project onto him, and that he learned to manage the gap between those two things with considerable sophistication. Plutarch records that he dressed carefully and expensively, but in ways that suggested ease rather than effort, which is a more sophisticated form of self-presentation than simple display. He cultivated a public persona that matched what Athens wanted a great aristocratic statesman to look like. He appeared at the right moments, in the right company. He understood that in a city as visually sophisticated as Athens, the presentation of self was itself a form of argument. There is a story in Plutarch about Alcibiades cutting off the tail of his expensive hunting dog, a dog that was famous and admired across Athens. When his friends were horrified and told him that everyone in the city was talking about the mutilated animal and condemning him for it, he apparently laughed and said that was exactly what he wanted, that as long as Athens was talking about his dog, they were not saying anything worse about him. The story may be embellished in its details. The principle it illustrates is not. He understood very early that in a democracy, attention is a resource. That being talked about, even negatively, is better than being ignored, and that a person who controls what people are talking about holds a kind of power that operates independently of official authority. This is a recognizably modern insight. It sits at the heart of how political communication works in any environment where attention is scarce and competition for it is constant. The fact that Alcibiades was operating this way in Athens in the late 5th century BC, in a culture with no mass media beyond public speech and word of mouth, suggests a level of social intelligence that was genuinely unusual even among people who were paid to think about such things. His wealth amplified everything. The family estates were substantial. The connections Pericles' guardianship had given him extended his access beyond what even family wealth would have provided. But it was his personal spending that made the most visible public impression. He entered 7 chariots in the Olympic Games of 416 BC. Not 1 chariot, not 2 or 3, 7. Thucydides, the great historian who was himself an Athenian general and not a man who wasted words on irrelevant details, notes this as unprecedented for a private citizen. According to Plutarch, his chariots placed first, second, and fourth, though he acknowledges his sources differ on the exact placements. The Olympic achievement was not simply athletic success. It was a public declaration on a scale that even the wealthiest Athenians could not easily match. A statement that Alcibiades existed in a different category from other people. He commissioned paintings. He had the city of Ephesus provide his tent at Olympia, apparently more magnificent than the official Athenian tent. He had animals for his sacrifices, provided by allied cities. He blurred. deliberately and skillfully. The line between personal display and civic contribution. Athens benefited from the prestige of his Olympic victories, and every time Athens benefited from what Alcibiades achieved, it made itself a little more complicit in what he got away with. He got away with a great deal. Plutarch describes a series of incidents from his early adult life that would have ended the political career of almost any other Athenian. He struck Hipponicus, one of the wealthiest men in Athens, in the face on a public bet. The next morning he appeared at Hipponicus's house, removed his cloak, and offered to be beaten in return. Hipponicus gave him his daughter in marriage instead. He prevented his wife Hipparete from presenting a petition for divorce by carrying her home from the magistrate's office. In public, while a crowd watched and did nothing, he detained the painter Agatharchus in his house until a commissioned work was finished, then paid him generously and released him. Agatharchus complained. No legal consequences followed. Each of these incidents, taken alone, might be explained or rationalized. Taken together, they form a pattern. Athens was watching the pattern develop in real time and choosing, repeatedly, not to address it. The reason keeps coming back to the same place. Athens wanted him, not despite what he was, including what he was, the excesses, the spectacle, the transgression of ordinary norms. Athens was a city built on ambition and sustained by competition, a city that had produced the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles and the philosophy of Socrates in the same generation, because it was genuinely, structurally oriented toward the extreme end of human possibility. Alcibiades was the extreme end of human possibility. He was what happened when Athens' deepest values, beauty, intelligence, ambition, the refusal to accept limits, were concentrated in a single person without the ethical framework that Socrates kept trying to supply. He was Athens looking at itself in a mirror, and somewhere in the back of that mirror, barely visible, was the philosopher who kept asking whether what Athens saw was actually what it thought it saw. The city loved the reflection, right up until the moment it did not. The assembly was waiting, the war was coming, and the most beautiful man in the room was preparing to walk to the speaker's platform and show the city exactly what it had made. Chapter 4. First Blood. The Political Debut. There is a moment in the life of every genuinely ambitious person when the world they have been preparing for finally opens in front of them. For most people, that moment arrives with some mixture of excitement and uncertainty. The recognition that the preparation is over and the actual test has begun. For Alcibiades, it arrived differently. He walked into the Athenian assembly for the first time as a speaker, and the crowd fell quiet, not from respect for his argument. From the sheer physical fact of his presence, he was in his early 20s, the most recognizable young aristocrat in Athens. He had the Olympic victories behind him, the family connections around him, and the specific kind of confidence that comes not from having been tested against the world, but from having never seriously doubted that the test would go your way. The Assembly of Athens was one of the most extraordinary political institutions in the ancient world. It met on the Pnyx, a hill shaped and terraced to accommodate thousands of citizens. Any male citizen could attend and speak. In practice, speaking effectively to several thousand people gathered on an open hillside, without amplification, in competition with the noise of a city and the impatience of an audience with other things to do, required a combination of physical presence, vocal projection, and rhetorical skill that very few people possessed naturally. Alcibiades had not been trained by the sophists in the conventional way. He had something different: the intelligence to understand what an audience wanted before they knew they wanted it, the physical presence to command attention before he had said anything worth attending to, and the social experience of a lifetime spent in rooms full of important people watching how power actually operated. Plutarch records an anecdote about an early appearance in the assembly. He had gone to watch rather than to speak when the crowd applauded something a previous speaker had proposed. Alcibiades asked what the applause was for, was told, and immediately pushed forward to speak in favour of the same proposal, presenting the argument with enough skill and confidence that the applause continued for him. The story may have acquired polish in the telling. The principle it captures is almost certainly accurate. He understood from very early that democratic politics is not primarily a contest of ideas. It is a contest of attention and alignment, and that the person who best reads the emotional temperature of a crowd and positions themselves as the expression of what that crowd already wants is the person who accumulates influence fastest. This insight was profound. It was also dangerous, because it treated the assembly as an instrument rather than as a body of citizens with genuine deliberative authority. Pericles had believed the demos could be educated and elevated. Alcibiades believed the demos could be managed. The difference between those two beliefs would matter enormously as the years went on. His early political career unfolded in the shadow of the Peace of Nicias, a truce negotiated in 421 BC between Athens and Sparta that was supposed to end the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. The war had been grinding since 431 BC. Both sides were exhausted. The Peace of Nicias was supposed to last 50 years. It lasted about 6. Alcibiades opposed it from the beginning. His reasons were partly personal, partly ideological, and partly the straightforward calculation of a young man who understood that peace was the enemy of ambition. Wars create opportunities. Wars require leadership. Wars produce the kind of dramatic, visible, consequential action that allows a gifted individual to rise faster than the slow accumulation of peacetime seniority would permit. His main rival in these years was Nicias, everything Alcibiades was not: cautious, methodical, deeply religious, constitutionally incapable of the bold improvisation that Alcibiades found instinctive, genuinely experienced. Having commanded Athenian forces in multiple campaigns with reasonable success, possessed of the kind of establishment credibility that comes from years of careful service rather than spectacular entrance, the competition between them was not simply personal rivalry, though it was certainly that. It was a contest between two fundamentally different theories of what Athens should be. Nicias believed Athens should consolidate what it had, defend its empire carefully, avoid the overextension that had already cost it so much. Alcibiades believed Athens should expand, that the energy and resources of the empire should be projected outward rather than hoarded, that the city was capable of more than its cautious establishment was willing to attempt. Both positions had genuine strategic logic. The debate between expansion and consolidation is one of the permanent debates of imperial history. What made the version playing out in Athens dangerous was that it was happening in a democratic assembly that could be moved by rhetoric as easily as by evidence. and the most rhetorically gifted participant in the debate was also the least interested in honest accounting of costs and risks. In the period around 417 BC, both Alcibiades and Nicias faced the prospect of ostracism, the democratic mechanism by which citizens could vote to exile a prominent individual for 10 years without charges or trial. What happened next, according to Plutarch, was that the two rivals made a private arrangement to direct their combined supporters against a third figure, a demagogue named Hyperbolus, who had been manoeuvring to use the process against one of them. Hyperbolus was ostracized instead. The episode was widely seen as a manipulation of the democratic process. Plutarch records that it apparently discredited ostracism so thoroughly that the mechanism was never used again in Athens after this point. The two men who had turned a democratic safety valve into a political weapon had effectively disabled one of the institutions designed to constrain people exactly like them. Athens was watching a pattern develop and could not quite bring itself to name what it was watching. The assembly that Alcibiades was learning to read so precisely was also the assembly he was gradually teaching to accept things it should not have accepted. Each transgression that went unpunished made the next one easier. Each demonstration that the rules applied differently to him made it more difficult to enforce them when it actually mattered. The moment when it actually mattered was approaching. It would arrive in the form of a proposal so bold, so expensive, and so potentially catastrophic that it would divide Athens almost perfectly between those who saw it as the opportunity of a generation and those who understood, with a clarity that the assembly refused to share, that it was the kind of gamble that democracies make when they have been convinced by a brilliant speaker that the cost of the bet will be paid by someone else. The proposal was for an expedition to Sicily, and behind it, giving it shape and energy, and the particular quality of danger that makes a bad idea seem like a historic opportunity, was the most politically gifted man Athens had ever produced. Chapter 5. The Sicilian Dream. There are decisions that look, in retrospect, so obviously catastrophic that it becomes almost impossible to reconstruct how anyone could have made them with genuine confidence. The Sicilian Expedition is one of those decisions. Stand in Piraeus, in the early summer of 415 BC. The largest fleet Athens has ever assembled is in the harbour in front of you. 134 triremes, their hulls freshly painted, their bronze rams catching the morning light off the water. More than 5,000 heavy infantry waiting to board. Crews of oarsmen, 3 deep on the rowing benches below the decks. The smell of salt and pine resin and fresh rope, and the particular excited noise of thousands of men who believe they are about to do something that will be remembered for generations. The families are here too, fathers and wives and children standing at the edge of the harbour, some of them trying to memorize a face, some of them too proud of what they are watching to be afraid of it yet. The city has come out to see itself set sail toward its own ambition. Athens has voted to send this fleet to the island of Sicily, roughly 1,000 miles to the west, to attack Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean. The stated justification is an appeal for help from the small Sicilian city of Egesta, in conflict with its neighbour Selinus. The actual motivation, as Thucydides makes clear, is considerably more ambitious. The conquest of Sicily is presented as a step toward eventual domination of the entire western Mediterranean, and through that domination, the permanent consolidation of Athenian power on a scale that would make Sparta strategically irrelevant. To understand how this got through the assembly, you need to understand both the strategic context and the specific way Alcibiades framed the argument. The peace of Nicias had been eroding for 5 years. The Spartan victory at Mantinea in 418 BC had demonstrated that Athens could not reshape the balance of power in the Peloponnese through the diplomatic strategies Alcibiades had been pursuing. The cold logic of the situation pointed toward a choice between accepting a permanently weakened position relative to Sparta or finding a different theatre where Athenian advantages, primarily naval power, could be brought to bear decisively. Sicily was that theatre. The Western Greek world was wealthy, divided, and far enough from Sparta that Spartan land power could not easily be projected there. A successful campaign would give Athens access to grain resources that would reduce its dependence on the Black Sea routes Sparta could threaten. It would bring wealthy Sicilian cities into the empire. It would demonstrate to the subject cities of the Aegean that Athens was still capable of offensive action on a grand scale. These were not irrational considerations. The strategic logic, taken in isolation, had genuine merit. The problem was not that the argument was stupid. The problem was that the argument was being made by someone with a structural interest in making the opportunity seem larger and the risks seem smaller than honest assessment would have produced. And it was being made to an audience that had been prepared over years to accept his framing. The assembly debate is described by Thucydides in one of the great set pieces of ancient historical writing. Nicias spoke first against the expedition. He made the arguments the evidence supported. The distance was enormous. Supply lines would be extended beyond anything Athens had maintained before. Syracuse was a powerful, well-defended city with its own navy and its own allies. The financial promises from Egesta were unverified. The peace of Nicias, fragile as it was, would be further destabilized by a major Western campaign. These were sound arguments, the arguments of a man who had spent decades thinking carefully about military risk. Nicias also made a tactical error, trying to discourage the assembly by emphasizing the scale of resources required. He demanded an even larger force than the original proposal specified. He believed that if the assembly understood the true cost, it would reconsider. The assembly heard him describe a larger fleet, a larger army, more ships, more soldiers, more supplies, and it got excited. This is one of the most instructive moments in the history of Athenian democracy. Nicias tried to use the reality of the cost as a deterrent. The assembly experienced the scale of the proposed expedition as a measure of its potential glory. The bigger the fleet, the more magnificent the victory. Nicias had misunderstood his audience. He thought he was speaking to people weighing costs against benefits. He was speaking to people who had already decided the benefits were essentially unlimited. Alcibiades understood exactly what had happened and pressed the advantage with precision. His speech, as reconstructed by Thucydides, is one of the most revealing documents in ancient political history. Thucydides, who was not an admirer, presents it with enough analytical clarity that the misdirection is visible to anyone reading carefully. Alcibiades began by addressing the charge that he was too young and too personally ambitious. He turned this charge into an argument for his credibility. His Olympic victories were evidence that his ambitions served Athens. The energy his critics called recklessness was precisely the quality that had made Athens great, and that a policy of cautious consolidation would slowly extinguish. The accusation of personal ambition converted into a demonstration of civic virtue. He argued that the Athenian Empire required constant expansion to remain viable, that a city that stopped moving forward would begin to move backward, that the subject cities of the empire respected power and would begin to defect the moment Athens appeared unwilling to project it. He was not entirely wrong about this. The argument had genuine strategic content. What it did not have was honest accounting. He did not address the specific logistical problems Nicias had raised. He did not engage with what happened if Syracuse proved more resilient than optimistic projections assumed. He did not discuss the implications for the Aegean position if the expedition failed and the fleet and army were lost. He did not acknowledge that the financial promises from Egesta were unverified. He did not tell the assembly that Sparta was not going to simply watch while Athens sent its best forces to the far end of the Mediterranean. Instead, he painted a picture vivid enough and exciting enough that the assembly did not notice the absence of a serious engagement with the downside. Thucydides writes that the Athenians were seized by a passionate desire for the expedition, that the old were enthusiastic, the young were on fire, and that those who had doubts kept quiet for fear of appearing unpatriotic by opposing what the majority so clearly wanted. People who knew the doubts were real. Keeping quiet, the assembly voted. 3 generals were appointed: Nicias, who had argued against it; Lamachus, a straightforward military man with genuine experience; and Alcibiades, who had argued for it, and whose appointment was the assembly's acknowledgment that the expedition was, in some fundamental way, his. Now come back to Piraeus. Back to that morning in the early summer of 415 BC. A libation is poured from golden and silver vessels all along the docks simultaneously. The sound of thousands of voices raised together in the paean carries across the water and up into the hills above the harbour. The crews take their positions. The oars go out. The first ships begin to move. The families watch from the dock. Some of them will wait years for news. Some of them will not receive news at all. They do not know this yet. Alcibiades stands on the deck of his flagship. The harbour of Piraeus falls behind him. The sea ahead is blue and enormous, and full of the promise that his argument had made it. There is a question that the philosopher he has been avoiding for years would have asked him, standing there on that deck, whether the city he is sailing away from is better or worse for what he has just done to it, whether the thousands of men now committed to following where his argument led have been served honestly by the person they are trusting with their lives. Alcibiades does not appear to have asked himself that question. He had gotten what he wanted. What he had not been told, or had not allowed himself to hear, was that something was already happening back in the city he had just left, something that would undo everything before the expedition ever reached its destination. The fleet was still sailing. The knives were already out. Chapter 6. The Scandal that Changed Everything. Athens woke on the morning of the departure to find that the Hermae had been mutilated. No philosophical preamble this time, just that fact. And the city it landed in, the Hermae were stone pillars topped with the head of Hermes, god of travellers and boundaries, that stood at doorways and street corners throughout Athens. They were not simply decorative objects. They were sacred markers with genuine religious significance. Present at the entrance to homes and public buildings and temples across the city, there were hundreds of them, and on that single night, in an act of coordinated vandalism that required planning and multiple participants, almost all of them had been defaced. the faces chipped away, the phalluses broken off. One night, hundreds of sacred objects, across the entire city. The effect was immediate and profound. The timing struck people first. The fleet was about to sail on the most ambitious expedition in Athenian history. The deliberate desecration of sacred objects on the night before departure was not simply a crime. In the religious understanding of 5th century Athens, it was a potential curse on the entire enterprise. The gods whose symbols had been destroyed might withdraw their protection. The men who sailed under such an omen might be sailing toward disaster, regardless of their numbers or their preparation. The religious dimension of this panic is easy to underestimate from a modern perspective. Athens was not a secular society making rational calculations. It was a city in which the relationship between human action and divine response was considered real and consequential in every significant undertaking. The mutilation of the Hermae was understood as a potential disruption of the sacred relationship between the city and its protecting gods. At the worst possible moment, the questions began immediately. Who had done this? How had it been coordinated? Who had the resources, the connections, and the motive to organize something on this scale? The name that kept surfacing was Alcibiades, not because there was direct evidence connecting him to the Hermae. There was not. The mutilation of the Hermae remains. To this day, one of the genuinely unsolved crimes of ancient history. Thucydides himself, writing with the advantage of hindsight and access to sources we no longer have, does not definitively attribute the act to any individual or group. Modern scholars have proposed various theories across the centuries, and none has achieved consensus. What there was, instead of evidence, was a pre-existing story about Alcibiades that made him the kind of person Athens was prepared to believe, capable of something like this. The Hermae accusation connected almost immediately to a separate charge that was in some ways more serious. Multiple informants, some of them slaves and resident foreigners rather than citizens, came forward to claim that Alcibiades had been involved in the profanation of the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred religious ceremony in Athenian life. Initiation rites so secret that their revelation to the uninitiated was a capital offence. The charge was that Alcibiades had reenacted the mysteries at private drinking parties, mocking the sacred ritual for the entertainment of his friends, with himself playing the role of the chief priest. The witnesses were not all reliable. Some were slaves whose testimony had been obtained under circumstances that Athenian law made complicated. Some had personal grievances against Alcibiades or his associates. Thucydides is careful about the quality of the evidence and notes that the accusations were driven as much by political calculation as by genuine religious outrage. But Thucydides also implies that some version of the mystery profanation may have actually occurred. Alcibiades and his circle were known for behaviour at private drinking parties that pushed against social and religious boundaries as a form of aristocratic display. Whether he actually did it is something the historical record does not allow us to determine with certainty. What it does make clear is that a substantial number of Athenians were prepared to believe he did it, and that the preparation for that belief had been building for years. This is the mechanism his enemies understood and exploited with considerable skill. Alcibiades had spent his entire public life accumulating a reputation for transgression. Each incident that had been tolerated, each norm bent or broken without consequence, each demonstration that the rules applied differently to him, all of it had been stored in the collective memory of Athens like kindling. The political moment required a spark. The mutilation of the Hermae provided it. His enemies were not a single organized faction. They were a coalition of different interests, united by the common goal of removing him before he accumulated enough power to become genuinely uncontrollable. Democratic politicians who feared his aristocratic influence. Allies of Nicias who saw the expedition as his project and understood that his removal would transfer its control. Personal enemies accumulated over a career of spectacularly inconsiderate behaviour, and people who genuinely believed the charges and were acting from sincere religious outrage. The coalition was effective because it did not need to prove its case beyond doubt. It needed only to make the case plausible enough that the assembly's fear did the rest. Alcibiades understood what was happening. He demanded an immediate trial. He did not flee. He did not try to manage the charges through political manoeuvring. He stood before the assembly and demanded that if there were accusations against him, they be heard now, before the fleet sailed, so that he could answer them and be either acquitted or condemned on the basis of evidence rather than rumour. This was both legally reasonable and politically intelligent. An immediate trial with Alcibiades present and able to defend himself. In an Athens that had just invested enormous resources in an expedition that needed his leadership, would likely have gone his way. The evidence was thin. The witnesses were questionable. And the practical argument that you do not condemn your best general on the eve of your most important military campaign had genuine force. His enemies refused. They argued that the fleet should sail on schedule and that the charges could be addressed on its return. The stated reason was practical. Delaying the expedition would damage morale and give Syracuse time to prepare. The actual reason, which Thucydides makes clear, was that an immediate trial would probably acquit him. They needed his absence and the time to build a stronger case, or simply to let fear and rumour do their work in the months he would be away. The assembly agreed to delay. Alcibiades sailed with the fleet. He sailed knowing he had enemies in Athens who were not finished with him, knowing the charges had not been answered and could be revived whenever his enemies chose, knowing that his position depended entirely on the success of the expedition and that any setback would be exploited by the people waiting for him at home. In the months after the fleet departed, the investigation continued with increasing intensity. The network of informants expanded. More names were added to the list of the accused. The atmosphere in Athens, as Thucydides records it, became one of genuine fear and mutual suspicion. Citizens denouncing each other in ways that had more to do with old scores and current political calculations than with the actual events of that night. The state ship Salaminia was dispatched to Sicily to recall Alcibiades for trial. He received the news with the calm of a man who had been expecting it. He agreed to return. He boarded his own ship to follow the Salaminia back to Athens. He never arrived. At the port of Thurii in southern Italy, Alcibiades slipped away from the escort and disappeared. A warrant was issued for his arrest. He was tried in his absence. He was condemned to death. His property was confiscated. The priests and priestesses of Athens were formally called upon by the state to curse him by name. The most powerful young man in Athens, the general who had convinced a city to stake its future on his vision, condemned to death, cursed by his own city's holy men. He was approximately 35 years old. He had spent a decade building a position in Athens that he believed was unassailable. He had been right about almost everything that mattered strategically. He had been wrong about the one thing that mattered more than all of it combined. He had believed that his usefulness to Athens would always outweigh the fear he inspired. It had not. And now the question was not how to recover his position in Athens. The question was whether he could survive long enough to have a position anywhere. His answer to that question was about to produce one of the most breathtaking acts of self-reinvention in the ancient world. Chapter 7. The Defection Athens' Worst Nightmare. There is a particular kind of person who, when they lose everything in one place, does not grieve the loss. They inventory what they still have. Alcibiades, standing on the Italian coast with a death sentence behind him and no certain future in front of him, had very little by ordinary measures. No property, no political office, no army or fleet. He was a condemned man whose own city had asked its gods to destroy him. What he still had was his mind. And his mind, which had spent 20 years studying power from inside the most powerful city in the Greek world, contained something that every enemy of Athens would pay almost any price to possess. He knew everything. He knew the strategy of the Sicilian campaign. He knew the weaknesses of the Athenian position in the Aegean. He knew which allied cities were genuinely loyal and which were waiting for an opportunity to defect. He knew the internal politics of Athens in the kind of granular detail that only someone who had operated at its centre could possess. He knew the personalities of every significant commander, politician, an ally that Athens depended on. He was the most valuable intelligence asset in the Greek world, and he was looking for somewhere to go. The decision to go to Sparta was not made in panic. Plutarch records no hesitation in the account that survives, and what followed suggested calculation rather than desperation. He was choosing survival over loyalty, and he was doing so with clear eyes about what that choice meant. It is worth being direct about this, because the story of Alcibiades is sometimes told in a way that sentimentalizes his betrayals, treating them as the understandable responses of a man who had been unfairly treated by a city that did not deserve his loyalty. That framing is not entirely wrong. Athens had treated him unjustly. The charges had been driven by political calculation as much as genuine outrage. The refusal to grant him an immediate trial had been specifically designed to prevent him from defending himself effectively. But going to Sparta and actively working against Athens is not made morally neutral by the injustice that preceded it. The people who would suffer most from the advice he was about to provide were not the politicians who had driven him out. They were the soldiers still in Sicily. The citizens of allied cities that depended on Athenian protection, the ordinary Athenians whose lives would be devastated by the consequences of what he was about to tell Sparta. He understood all of this. He went anyway. His arrival in Sparta was itself a performance that only someone with his particular combination of intelligence and social flexibility could have pulled off. Sparta was everything Athens was not. Austere where Athens was extravagant. Militaristic where Athens was artistic. Deeply, structurally suspicious of exactly the kind of brilliant, charming, flexible intelligence that Alcibiades represented. The Spartans had a word for foreigner, xenos. That carried a weight of suspicion that Athenian culture did not replicate. Alcibiades arrived in Sparta and became Spartan. He cut his hair in the Spartan style. He adopted the simple diet and the cold baths and the physical hardship that Spartan culture valorized and that Athenian aristocrats would normally have found laughably primitive. He spoke to Spartan officials without the rhetorical elaboration and political performance that had made him famous in Athens, adopting instead the laconic directness that gave the English language the word laconic itself. From the region of Laconia, where Sparta was located, Plutarch records that the Spartans found this transformation both impressive and somewhat alarming. They recognized that a man who could change himself so completely and so quickly was not a man who had genuinely become one of them. He was a man demonstrating that he could become whatever the situation required. That is a different and more unsettling thing. But the Spartans were practical enough to use what he was offering. His specific recommendations, as recorded by Thucydides, were precise and in their consequences for Athens deeply damaging. They reflected not just knowledge of Athenian vulnerabilities, but a genuine understanding of what would hurt most and be hardest to recover from. The first recommendation was to send a Spartan commander to Syracuse to stiffen the Sicilian resistance. The expedition, he explained, was not yet lost. The Athenian forces were struggling, but still capable of succeeding if left without competent opposition. What was needed was not a large Spartan army, but a single, capable commander who could organize the Syracusans more effectively. Sparta sent Gylippus, a general of genuine ability. He arrived, reorganized the Syracusan defense, led counterattacks that disrupted the Athenian siege, and shifted the psychological momentum of the entire campaign. The Syracusans, who had been close to negotiating a surrender before his arrival, found themselves capable of sustained resistance instead. The second recommendation was more structurally damaging. Alcibiades advised Sparta to establish a permanent fortified position at Decelia, in Attica itself, close enough to Athens that a garrison there could maintain continuous pressure on the city and its surrounding territory. Temporary Spartan invasions had allowed Attica to recover in between campaigns. A permanent fortification eliminated that recovery time entirely, and Alcibiades knew, from having grown up in Athens, precisely what that would cost. Sparta established the Decelia garrison in the spring of 413 BC and maintained it for the remainder of the war. The third element of his counsel concerned Persia, specifically the Persian satrap Tissaphernes. Alcibiades advised Sparta to cultivate Persian financial support, arguing that Persian money combined with Spartan military power would create a combination that Athens could not sustain indefinitely. This recommendation addressed the fundamental asymmetry that had made the first phase of the war a stalemate. Sparta had the land army, Athens had the navy and the imperial revenues. Persian money flowing to Sparta would allow it to build a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval supremacy, which would threaten the imperial revenues, which would collapse the cycle that kept Athens viable as a military power. He was describing, with the clarity of someone who understood Athens from the inside, the precise sequence of steps that would dismantle it. Thucydides is careful in his account here, as he is throughout. He records these recommendations as Alcibiades' counsel. He presents them as historically consequential. He does not argue that Alcibiades was solely responsible for what followed. The historical picture involves multiple causes and multiple actors. What Thucydides does make clear is that the council accelerated and sharpened Spartan strategy in ways that were specifically harmful to Athens, and that it came from a man who understood exactly what he was providing. He told the Spartans, according to Thucydides, that his patriotism was not dead but transformed, that a man's true country was not the place that had wronged him, but the place where he could live with honour. That he was not attacking Athens out of hatred, but out of necessity. The argument is logically coherent. It is also the argument of a man who has constructed a justification sophisticated enough that he does not have to acknowledge plainly what he is actually doing. There was one thing he had not accounted for in his calculation. Sparta was not Athens. The same flexibility and social intelligence that had allowed him to present himself as Spartan was also the quality that made the Spartans, once their initial use for him was satisfied, deeply uncomfortable with his continued presence. And he had made the specific mistake, according to Plutarch, of compromising the domestic situation of the Spartan king Agis. The details of that situation and the degree to which the account can be fully trusted are matters that ancient sources handle inconsistently. What is consistent across the accounts is the consequence. Alcibiades had made a mortal enemy of a Spartan king, not a politician who could be charmed, a man with both the motive and the institutional means to have him killed. Agis worked toward exactly that. The man who had outmaneuvered Athens was now being hunted by Sparta. He was approximately 37 years old. He had nowhere left to go except east. And in the east, in the court of the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, the first faint outline of a more ambitious possibility was beginning to take shape, not simply offering one power the knowledge to damage another, something considerably more complex than that, something that, if it worked, might eventually point toward home. Chapter 8. Teaching Sparta to destroy Athens. There is a specific kind of damage that only an insider can do. An external enemy, however powerful, attacks what it can see. It strikes at walls and fleets and armies, at the visible architecture of power that a city presents to the world. The damage is real and sometimes catastrophic, but it is damage a city can understand and respond to. Because it comes from outside and can be identified and met, the damage that comes from someone who was inside is different in kind. It finds the specific vulnerabilities that years of intimate knowledge have mapped with precision. It knows where the load-bearing structures actually are as opposed to where they appear to be. It is targeted in a way that external attack cannot be. It is, in the most literal sense, the turning of trust into a weapon. What Alcibiades did to Athens between 415 and 412 BC was that kind of damage, not because he was uniquely evil, but because he was uniquely positioned, and because he had made the calculation that his survival required it. We have already examined his three main strategic recommendations to Sparta: the dispatch of Gylippus to Syracuse, the permanent fortification of Decilia, the cultivation of Persian financial support. Each was consequential on its own. Together, they constituted something close to a comprehensive guide to dismantling the Athenian imperial system from the outside, using knowledge accumulated from the inside. But a list of recommendations does not fully capture what happened. To understand the real weight of this period, you need to follow the consequences to where they landed. Not in assembly debates or strategic memoranda, in the lives of the people who paid for them. The Sicilian disaster unfolded across 2 years. When Gylippus arrived in Syracuse in the summer of 414 BC, the Athenian expedition was struggling, but not yet broken. The besieging force had established its base at the great harbour, had constructed substantial fortifications, and had achieved enough early momentum to make the Syracusans genuinely uncertain about their capacity to hold out. Thucydides. who had access to accounts from people on both sides, describes a situation that was still genuinely open. Gylippus closed it. He arrived with a small force, but he brought something more important than numbers: competence, confidence, a clear vision of how to break the Athenian siege. He reorganized the Syracusan forces. He led counterattacks that disrupted the Athenian wall building. He shifted the psychological momentum of the entire campaign. The Syracusans, who had been close to opening negotiations, found themselves capable of sustained resistance instead. The Athenians sent reinforcements. Demosthenes arrived with a second fleet in 413 BC. The additional force briefly reversed the momentum. Then the Syracusans adapted. The attempt by Demosthenes to break the deadlock with a night attack on the Epipolae plateau ended in chaos. Athenian soldiers killing each other in the darkness. The battle dissolving into confusion that no commander could see clearly enough to direct. After that failure, the generals should have ordered an immediate withdrawal. The strategic situation was irretrievable. Nicias refused to leave. He was waiting for a favourable sign, and when a lunar eclipse occurred, his soothsayers advised a delay of 27 days before any major movement. 27 days. Thucydides records this without editorial comment. He does not need to add any. The Syracusans used those 27 days to prepare a naval offensive that destroyed the Athenian fleet in the harbour. The destruction of the fleet left the army stranded. What followed was one of the most harrowing retreats in ancient military history. Tens of thousands of men attempting to march across hostile territory, pursued by Syracusan cavalry, harassed on all sides, dying from wounds and disease and thirst, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing you are not going to make it. The column shrank day by day. The remnants were surrounded in a riverbed and forced to surrender. Nicias and Demosthenes were executed. The survivors, roughly 7,000 men, according to Thucydides, though ancient sources do not all agree on precise figures, were imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse, held in open air through the summer heat and autumn cold, dying slowly of exposure and illness and insufficient food. Most of them died there. Athens had lost, by the various estimates that ancient sources provide and do not agree on precisely, a catastrophic number of soldiers and sailors, along with the greater part of 200 triremes. Thucydides does not provide a single confirmed total, and scholars have continued to discuss the exact scale of the losses. What is not in discussion is the category of what happened. This was not a defeat. It was an annihilation. Consider what those losses meant for a city. Athens had a total male citizen population of perhaps 30,000 adults. The expedition had drawn from that population and from allied crews and subject city contingents. When the news arrived in Athens, it arrived in stages. As Thucydides describes with careful restraint, the first reports were disbelieved. The scale was simply outside the range of what people were prepared to accept as real. Then confirmation came. Almost every family lost someone. That is not rhetoric. That is what the scale of the losses meant in a city of that size. The men who had stood at the harbour in Piraeus, watching the fleet sail with such pride, the men who had been too proud of what they were watching to be afraid of it yet, gone. Now, how much of this was connected to Alcibiades' counsel to Sparta? The honest answer requires holding several things at once. The Sicilian disaster had multiple causes. The original decision to send the expedition reflected strategic overreach that preceded any advice Alcibiades gave Sparta. The command dysfunction between the three generals was a problem he did not create. The specific military mistakes made in the field, including the fatal delay for the lunar eclipse, came from Nicias. Syracuse was a powerful city that would have resisted fiercely under any circumstances. Alcibiades was one significant factor among several, not the sole cause, but the dispatch of Gylippus, which followed from his specific counsel, was among the factors that prevented Athens from securing a victory that the expedition had at an earlier stage been genuinely capable of achieving. The difference between the outcome that happened and a better outcome for Athens passed, in part, through the advice he gave. That is the honest assessment. The fortification of Decilia produced a different quality of damage, slower, more structural, the kind that does not announce itself in a single event but accumulates over months and years until the foundations have been hollowed out beneath a system that still looks, from the outside, as if it is functioning. The Spartan garrison at Decilia was positioned on high ground in northern Attica, close enough that its occupants could see Athens on clear days. Raiding parties moved continuously through the surrounding countryside, preventing farming, destroying property, creating a permanent state of insecurity in the territory the city depended on for food production and timber and the resources that any functioning community requires from its surrounding land. The slave flight that followed was perhaps the most economically damaging single consequence. More than 20,000 slaves fled to the Spartan position, the majority of them skilled workers from the silver mines at Laurion. Those mines had provided a crucial part of Athenian revenue for generations. They essentially ceased to function. The financial foundation of Athenian naval supremacy had been removed by the people who had been forced to create it, choosing the risk of uncertain freedom over the certainty of continued servitude. Athens moved from imperial confidence to permanent crisis management. Every decision now required calculating against a resource base that was shrinking. Every strategic choice required asking what could no longer be afforded. And in the background, the Persian dimension was developing. Persian money began flowing towards Spartan naval construction, the fleet that Sparta had always lacked. That had been the fundamental reason why the first phase of the war ended in stalemate rather than Athenian defeat, was beginning to be built, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Alcibiades had understood something that most strategic analysts of his era had not fully articulated. The Peloponnesian War was not primarily a contest between two military systems. It was a contest between two economic models. Athens' naval empire generated revenues that funded the fleet that projected the power that maintained the empire. Sparta's land power was formidable but geographically limited. The way to hurt Athens was not to win a land battle. It was to disrupt the economic cycle that made Athenian power sustainable. Persian money, flowing to a Spartan fleet, disrupted that cycle. There is an uncomfortable editorial judgment required here, and it is better to state it plainly than to avoid it. Alcibiades was right about almost everything he told Sparta. The advice was strategically sound. The analysis of Athens' vulnerabilities was accurate in ways that subsequent events confirmed. He told them the truth, and the truth was devastating. This is what makes his story genuinely difficult, rather than simply dramatic. The question he forces us to confront is not whether he was clever, it is whether cleverness without loyalty produces anything worth calling a life. He had told the truth to Athens' enemies about how to hurt Athens, and in doing so he had provided something no external analysis could have provided. The specific knowledge of where Athens was actually vulnerable, as opposed to where it appeared vulnerable. There is a deeper question underneath all of this that deserves to be asked directly. What does it mean for a city when one of its most gifted citizens turns those gifts against it? Not out of ideology or genuine conviction that the enemy's cause is just, but out of the calculation that survival requires it. Athens had created Alcibiades, had given him the education and the connections and the platform that made him what he was, had also, through the specific mechanisms of its democratic politics, produced the fear and the resentment and the manoeuvring that had driven him out. The damage he inflicted was, in a meaningful sense, the city's own intelligence turned back against itself. The assembly that had voted for the Sicilian Expedition with such enthusiasm had also been the assembly that refused him an immediate trial. Both facts belong to the same story. This is not a defence of what he did. It is an accurate description of how it happened, and it is, perhaps, the most important thing the story of his time in Sparta asks us to think about. Not that brilliant people are dangerous, not that betrayal is simply evil, but that systems which produce exceptional individuals without developing honest mechanisms to integrate them will eventually be damaged by the very gifts they cultivated. Athens had not found a way to hold Alcibiades, and the cost of losing him to the other side was being paid, in Sicily and in Attica and in the Persian satrapies of the East, by people who had no voice in the assembly decision that had driven him away. He was still in Sparta when the consequences of his advice were still accumulating, and Sparta, as we have already seen, was becoming as dangerous to him as Athens had been. The king whose domestic situation he had compromised was not finished with him. The Persian East was beginning to look like the only place left where a man of his specific qualities could find room to operate. And somewhere in that eastward calculation, the first faint outline of a different possibility was beginning to take shape, a possibility that even now, after everything, might eventually point back toward home. Chapter 9. The second defection escaping Sparta. There is a particular kind of intelligence that is most visible not in its successes, but in the speed with which it adapts to failure. Most people, when a situation collapses around them, spend time grieving. They replay the decisions that led to it. They look for someone else to blame. They construct narratives that preserve their self-image against the evidence that they have made mistakes. Alcibiades did not grieve. By the time it became clear that his position in Sparta was untenable, he had already begun building what came next. The transition from Sparta to Persia was not a desperate flight. It was a calculated repositioning, and embedded within it was the outline of something considerably more ambitious than mere survival. To understand what he was attempting, you need to understand the situation Athens was in by 412 BC. The news of the Sicilian disaster had reached Athens in stages that Thucydides describes with controlled precision. The first reports were disbelieved. Then confirmation came. Then the city had to absorb what confirmation meant. Athens reorganized, with the particular resilience that had allowed it to survive the Persian invasion and the plague and the first phase of the Peloponnesian War. It began to rebuild. It established an emergency committee of older advisers, the Probulua, to provide more measured counsel than the full assembly had shown itself capable of. It recalled exiles. It cut expenditures. It threw its remaining resources into maintaining the naval operations that were the only thing standing between continued imperial revenues and total financial collapse. But the subject cities of the empire were watching. The Sicilian disaster had demonstrated something that every subject city had reason to monitor: that Athens could be beaten, that the fleet, which had made resistance unthinkable, was not invincible. Defections began almost immediately. Chios, one of the most important and wealthy of Athens' allied cities, revolted in 412 BC. Others followed. The Eastern Aegean, the economic heart of the empire, began to fracture. It was into this situation that Alcibiades arrived at the court of Tissaphernes. Tissaphernes was the Persian satrap responsible for the western coast of Asia Minor and the adjacent Aegean, a man of considerable political sophistication who had spent his career navigating the complex relationships between Persian imperial authority and the Greek city-states on his doorstep. He was not a simple ally waiting to be directed. He was an independent actor with his own interests, his own constraints, and his own theory of how the Greek conflict served Persian strategic goals. The Persian theory, which Tissaphernes held and which Alcibiades would both exploit and refine, was essentially this: Persia's long-term interest was not in a Greek world dominated by either Athens or Sparta. It was in a Greek world where neither power was strong enough to threaten Persian interests. A prolonged war that exhausted both sides served Persia better than a quick victory for either. When Alcibiades arrived, he found a man already thinking in these terms. What Alcibiades offered Tissaphernes was what he had offered everyone he approached since leaving Athens: his knowledge, his analysis, his ability to see the Greek situation with the clarity of someone who had operated at its centre. And in his conversations with the satrap he began articulating the theory of managed equilibrium in terms that Tissaphernes found both familiar and more precisely formulated than anything his own advisers had provided. Plutarch records that Alcibiades advised Tissaphernes to reduce the payments to the Spartan fleet, to support neither side strongly enough to achieve a decisive victory, to wait for the exhaustion of both powers before committing Persian resources to a definitive intervention. This advice served Tissaphernes' interests. It also served Alcibiades' interests in a way that was not immediately obvious, but that the pattern of his subsequent actions makes visible. If Persian money stopped flowing to Sparta at full strength, Spartan naval construction would slow. The Persian-funded fleet that could break Athenian naval supremacy would be delayed. Athens would survive longer than it would have otherwise, and an Athens still surviving, still desperate, still willing to consider options it would have rejected from a position of strength, might be willing to consider the option of recalling the man it had exiled. The pattern of his actions, examined in hindsight, points toward a man who was engineering the conditions for his own return, not reacting to circumstances, constructing them. The Spartans noticed that Persian payments had become less reliable. They suspected Alcibiades, Agis, whose personal grievance against him had not diminished with distance, continued working toward his elimination. Spartan agents were sent, according to Plutarch, with instructions to kill him. They did not succeed. He was also, in this same period, beginning to make contact with elements of the Athenian fleet stationed at Samos. What he was doing with the Athenian fleet officers was not a simple approach to a single party. He was moving simultaneously on multiple fronts, telling each party something different about his intention, working toward an outcome that served none of them purely, and served himself primarily. To the Athenian officers at Samos, he sent word that he could help deliver Persian support to Athens if the Athenians were willing to change their government. Specifically, he suggested that a more oligarchic Athens, one in which the radical democracy was replaced by a more restricted constitution, would be more acceptable to Persia and would unlock the Persian financial support that could allow Athens to continue the war. This was partly true and partly a construction. It was true that Tissaphernes was more comfortable with oligarchic regimes than with radical democracy. It was not true that Alcibiades had a firm commitment from Tissaphernes to support Athens if the government changed. The gap between what he was promising and what he could actually deliver was significant. He was overstating his influence with the Persian in order to make himself seem indispensable to the Athenians, while simultaneously using the possibility of Athenian rapprochement to make himself seem valuable to Tissaphernes. It was a high-stakes performance built on real knowledge, but aimed beyond what that knowledge could fully guarantee. The Athenian officers at Samos were divided. The democratic faction was deeply sceptical of any arrangement requiring a constitutional change. Others, the ambitious and the desperate and the ideologically flexible, were willing to consider it. The result was one of the most turbulent periods in Athenian political history. The 400, an oligarchic council, seized power in Athens in 411 BC, overthrowing the democracy in a coup that drew its justification partly from the promise of Persian support that Alcibiades had been describing. The democracy fell. The promised Persian support did not materialize. Tissaphernes had made no firm commitment. When the 400 looked for the Persian money that was supposed to validate their coup, they found that the connection between Alcibiades and Tissaphernes did not translate into the concrete financial support they had been expecting. The oligarchy of the 400 lasted approximately 4 months before internal contradictions and the resistance of the fleet at Samos forced its collapse. A more moderate arrangement, known as the 5,000, briefly replaced it before the full democracy was restored. And through all of this turbulence, Alcibiades had positioned himself with characteristic precision. He had not committed to the 400. He had not been in Athens when the coup occurred. He was at Samos with the fleet, with the democratic sailors who had rejected the oligarchy, and when the democracy began reasserting itself through the fleet, Alcibiades was there, available, useful, the man who could claim credit for whatever the fleet achieved without bearing responsibility for the oligarchic revolution that his manoeuvring had helped enable. He was elected general by the fleet at Samos in 411 BC, the man condemned to death by Athens, whose property had been confiscated, whose name had been formally cursed by the city's priests, was an Athenian general again. He had not yet returned to Athens itself. The formal restoration of his citizenship required a vote by the assembly in the city, and the political situation was still too volatile for that immediately. But the direction was set. The man who had gone to Sparta and then to Persia, who had helped shape the advice that accelerated Athens' difficulties, who had played 3 powers against each other with a precision that left all of them uncertain whether they were using him or being used by him, was coming back. Athens, desperate and diminished, was preparing to welcome him. The question that the evidence insistently raises is this: did Athens want Alcibiades back because it had made an honest reassessment of his value and a genuine reconciliation with the injustice of his original exile? Or did it want him back because it was afraid? And because a city that is afraid will reach for the most compelling thing available, regardless of what that thing has done, the answer, as it so often is with Athens and Alcibiades, was both, and the combination, as it so often was with both of them, was going to produce something more complicated and more painful than either the hope or the fear had anticipated. Some things, once released into the world, do not come back when called. Chapter 10. The Impossible Return. There are moments in the life of a city when it chooses hope over memory, not because the memory has faded, not because the reasons for the original fear have been resolved or the original injuries honestly addressed, but because the situation has become desperate enough that the city needs something to believe in more than it needs to be consistent. Athens, in 407 BC, was that kind of city. 7 years had passed since the fleet sailed from Piraeus with its golden vessels and its singing and its enormous, confident expectation. In those 7 years, Athens had lost the expedition it had sent to Sicily. It had lost control of significant parts of its empire. It had experienced an oligarchic revolution that had overturned the democracy it had built over generations. It had watched Sparta build a naval capacity that Athenian supremacy had once made unthinkable. And through all of this, the fleet at Samos under Alcibiades' command had been fighting. The campaigns he had conducted since his election as general at Samos in 411 BC had been, by any honest military assessment, genuinely impressive. He won at Abydos. He won at Cyzicus in 410 BC, a naval engagement in which the Athenian fleet destroyed the Spartan force so completely that a captured Spartan message home read, according to Plutarch, ships gone, Mindarus dead, men starving, do not know what to do. He had also recovered several important cities on the Hellespont and the Propontis, the straits through which the grain ships from the Black Sea had to pass to reach Athens. The grain routes were the lifeline of the city. By recovering control of them, Alcibiades had done something more important than winning battles. He had restored the economic circulatory system that Athens needed to survive as a functioning imperial power. Think about what this moment represented in the story of the man. The philosopher who had once pursued him through the agora of Athens, who had spent years trying to show him that his gifts could serve something larger than himself, would have recognized in these campaigns something that the social world of Athens had never quite produced in him, a sustained commitment to something beyond his own immediate advantage. Whether it was genuine, or whether it was simply the pragmatic recognition that his personal fortunes were now tied to Athenian recovery, the result looked, from the outside, like the thing Socrates had always been asking for. It had taken everything going wrong to produce it, and it would not last. The assembly cancelled his death sentence and restored his citizenship in 408 BC. The priests were instructed to withdraw their curses. His property was to be returned. The official machinery of his condemnation was put into reverse with the same democratic decisiveness that had originally condemned him. There was debate about this. Plutarch records Athenians who thought that recalling him was dangerous, regardless of his recent military performance, that a man who had provided counsel to the city's enemies and then managed his way back through manipulation rather than genuine reconciliation was not someone who could be trusted with Athens' last remaining assets. These voices were not irrational. They were applying the evidence of his entire career to the question of what he would do next. They were overruled by the voices of hope and desperation. The return itself, in the summer of 407 BC, was one of the most theatrically extraordinary events in Athenian history. He sailed into the harbour of Piraeus with a fleet according to Plutarch, of around 20 triremes. The harbour was full of people. Plutarch describes the scene with an attention to emotional detail that suggests he was drawing on accounts written by people who were present. The crowd was enormous. There were people weeping, people simply staring, trying to reconcile the living man on the deck with the figure that 7 years of absence and rumour had created. His friends were there. His enemies were watching. The return of Alcibiades was not an event that anyone with any stake in Athenian politics could afford to ignore. He did not step ashore immediately. He stood at the rail of his ship, scanning the crowd, looking for the specific faces that would tell him whether the restoration was genuine or whether the welcome was a surface beneath which the old dangers were still operating. He was looking for friends who had worked for his recall, and whose presence at the dock would signal that the political ground was solid enough to step onto. He saw them. He came ashore. The crowd surrounded him immediately. People reached out to touch him. There were tears on faces he recognized and faces he did not. The city that had condemned him and cursed him and confiscated everything he owned was embracing him with the intensity of a community that has been frightened for a long time and has decided, regardless of the complications, that this particular person represents the possibility that things might still be all right. He made his way to the assembly. The speech he gave has not survived in the detail that Thucydides preserves the major speeches of the war. What Plutarch gives us is a characterization, a speech in which Alcibiades did not quite apologize and did not quite explain, but managed to position his entire history in a way that placed the weight of responsibility on his enemies rather than on his own choices. He spoke about injustice. He spoke about what had been done to him. He spoke about his victories. He was careful not to dwell on the years in Sparta, or on what his council there had actually contributed to Athens' difficulties. The assembly, which needed him and was in no position to be forensically honest about what his choices had cost, did not press him on those specifics. This is one of the most revealing moments in the entire relationship between Athens and Alcibiades. A city conducting an honest accounting of what had happened would have asked direct questions and required direct answers. The assembly did not do this, not because it was naive about what he had done, but because it had already decided that it needed him more than it needed honest accounting. He was appointed to a broad command with authority that reflected how completely Athens had committed to the proposition that he was the solution to its problems. He also organized, for the first time in years, the Eleusinian Mysteries procession by land. Since the Spartan occupation of Decelia, the annual procession from Athens to Eleusis had been conducted by sea because the land route passed through territory controlled by the Spartan garrison. Alcibiades organized military protection for the land route and led the procession himself. The symbolism was almost impossible to miss. The man accused of profaning the Eleusinian mysteries was now the man who had restored the mysteries procession to its proper form. The accusation had been annulled, not just legally, but publicly, visually. In the most sacred ceremony Athens possessed, he understood, as he always understood, that politics is not only about what is true, it is also about what is seen. The procession reached Eleusis safely. Athens celebrated, and Plutarch notes, with the careful restraint of a biographer who has seen how these stories end, that the celebration was perhaps too complete, that the city had invested too much of its emotional and political capital in a single person. That fragility was about to become visible. Before Alcibiades could engage Sparta in the kind of decisive campaign his appointment was intended to enable, He had to prepare the fleet at Samos for major operations. He left the main force under the command of his helmsman, a man named Antiochus, with specific instructions. Do not engage the Spartan fleet under Lysander in a pitched battle until I return. Antiochus disobeyed. He sailed out against the Spartan fleet in a provocative manoeuvre that drew the Athenians into exactly the kind of engagement Alcibiades had specifically prohibited. Lysander, one of the most capable commanders Sparta produced in the entire war, met the Athenian challenge with precisely organized force. The Athenians were defeated at the Battle of Notium in 406 BC. It was not Sicily. It was a real defeat. By any honest military assessment, the defeat at Notium was the fault of Antiochus. Alcibiades had not been present. He had not given the order that led to the engagement. He had given the opposite order. Athens did not make that distinction. The assembly voted to remove him from command. The speed of the reversal is one of the most instructive things about it. The city that had wept at his return, that had given him broad command, that had watched him restore the mysteries procession in triumph, turned on him within months of the first military setback under his nominal command. This was Athens being consistent in a way. The same emotional intensity that produced the tears of welcome produced the anger of reversal. The same democratic mechanism that had recalled him removed him. The assembly that had decided it needed him decided, with equal decisiveness, that it no longer did. Alcibiades did not wait for what came next. He knew Athens too well to believe that removal from command was where the political consequences would stop. He had seen what happened when the assembly turned. He had experienced the sequence before, and he was not going to stand in place and wait for it to complete itself again. He left. He sailed north to the Thracian Chersonese, where he had acquired, during his years of successful command, a series of small fortified strongholds and local alliances that gave him the resources to maintain himself independently. He was approximately 43 years old. He had returned to Athens in triumph less than a year earlier. He was leaving again, not in disgrace exactly, but in the particular condition of a man who has been used and then set aside, who has delivered real value and been blamed for someone else's failure, and who knows with complete clarity that the city he is leaving will regret what it has just done. He was right about that. In the months after his departure, Athens made the decisions that led to the Battle of Aegospotami. Lysander caught the Athenian fleet beached and undermanned on the European side of the Hellespont and destroyed it almost entirely. It was the final naval defeat that ended Athenian resistance. Plutarch records that in the days before Aegospotami, Alcibiades could see the Athenian fleet from his strongholds in Thrace. He understood that it was positioned dangerously. He rode down to the Athenian camp and told the generals they were exposed, that they should move to a better harbour, that Lysander was more capable than they were treating him. The generals told him to leave. He left. He watched from the hills as the attack he had predicted destroyed the fleet he had tried to warn. Athens fell to Sparta in 404 BC. The long walls were torn down. The democracy was suspended. The 30 tyrants, installed by Sparta, took power and conducted the reign of terror that Plato would later describe with the horror of someone who watched it from inside. Alcibiades was in Thrace when all of this happened. He was not there to see the walls come down. He was preparing, according to accounts that survive in Plutarch, for another approach to Persia, another attempt to find the leverage that would allow him to matter again. Whether that approach would have worked is one of the permanently unanswerable questions of ancient history, because he was running out of time, and the people who wanted him dead were not going to give him the opportunity to find out. Chapter 11. The Fall. Again, there is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs to people who have operated at the absolute centre of great events, and then find themselves standing outside everything that matters. It is not the ordinary loneliness of isolation. It is more precise than that. It is the loneliness of someone who can still see everything with complete clarity, who still understands what is happening and why, who still has the analytical capacity that once made them indispensable, and who has no one left who is willing to listen. Alcibiades in his Thracian exile had that kind of loneliness. He was not destitute. The strongholds he had established during his years of successful command gave him a base and a degree of material security. He had local alliances, a small military force, and the resources to maintain himself as an independent presence in a region that was strategically significant because of its proximity to the grain routes and the connections between Europe and Asia. He was also, by any conventional measure, completely irrelevant to the decisions that were determining the outcome of the war. The contrast between his material position and his strategic position captures something essential about the final phase of his story. He had the intelligence and the experience and the personal authority that should have made him central to everything. He had specific knowledge of Spartan strategy, Persian politics, and Athenian vulnerabilities that would have been invaluable to anyone managing the endgame of the war. And he was in Thrace, watching from a distance, because the specific sequence of decisions and betrayals and failures that his career had produced had left him without a constituency. Athens had removed him from command. Sparta wanted him dead. Persia had shifted. Cyrus the Younger, a Persian prince more actively interested in decisive Spartan victory than Tissaphernes had been, had taken over the management of Persian support for the Spartan war effort. Cyrus had a direct relationship with Lysander. The multi-sided game that Alcibiades had been playing between Athens, Sparta, and Persia required all three parties to see value in his participation. Cyrus did not need him. Lysander did not want him. Athens had just rejected him. He was out of moves. Not permanently. He was never the kind of person who accepted permanence in a negative situation. But in 405 BC, the openings were not there. The episode at Aegospotami was the final confirmation of his irrelevance in the immediate military situation. He had seen the danger. He had said so directly. He had been dismissed by men who would rather lose the battle than accept advice from the man their city had just removed from command. They chose their political futures over their fleet. The fleet was destroyed anyway. After Aegospotami, after the fall of Athens, after the installation of the 30 tyrants, Alcibiades was in a position that required honest assessment of what was left. He was 44 or 45 years old. He was in a stronghold in Thrace. He was watching his city lose everything. He was alive, which was more than many of his contemporaries could say. But alive in the specific, reduced sense of someone who has survived the destruction of the world they were built to inhabit. The question of what his remaining options were was one he appears to have approached with the pragmatism that had characterized every previous crisis. Persia remained the most promising avenue, not Tissaphernes, whose influence had been eclipsed, but Persia in a broader sense. The empire was enormous, and its internal politics were complex. Cyrus the Younger was not the king. He was a prince with ambitions of his own that would eventually lead him to mount the rebellion against his brother Artaxerxes II that Xenophon would later describe in the Anabasis. A Persian court in flux, with competing factions and uncertain succession, was exactly the kind of environment where someone with Alcibiades' specific qualities might find a foothold. He began making his way east. Whether he had a specific plan, or whether the approach to the Persian court was itself a way of keeping options open while the situation in Greece settled into its post-war configuration, is something the ancient sources do not fully clarify. Plutarch is our main source for this period, and he is working with accounts that were themselves already incomplete. What is clear is that Alcibiades travelled through Macedonia and into territory controlled by Pharnabazus, the Persian satrap of the Hellespont region, who had been a significant figure in the final phase of the war. His approach to Pharnabazus was the same fundamental offer he had made to every powerful figure he had approached since leaving Athens. His knowledge, his analysis, his ability to see the Greek situation with the clarity of an insider. Pharnabazus received him with apparent cordiality. Alcibiades was given accommodation in Phrygia. He was provided with resources to maintain himself in reasonable comfort. He was, in effect, a guest of the Persian satrapy, while the question of what to do with him was resolved at higher levels. He was also, almost certainly, under watch. The Persians were not naive about what Alcibiades was. They had seen what had happened to Athens when it trusted him. They had seen what had happened to Sparta when it trusted him. A man with his history was an asset only if he could be controlled. And the question of whether Alcibiades could be controlled was one that no one who had tried had successfully answered. While he was in Phrygia, the 30 tyrants were conducting their reign of terror in Athens. The men installed by Sparta to govern the defeated city were systematically eliminating political opponents, confiscating property, and creating the conditions of fear that Plato would later describe. Among those who suffered were people connected to Alcibiades, people whose association with him had made them targets in the polarized political environment that his career had helped create. The 30 also, according to some ancient sources, sent word to Lysander that Alcibiades should be eliminated. Lysander had his own reasons to want him dead. A man with Alcibiades' abilities and his specific knowledge of Spartan strategy, now positioning himself at the Persian court, was precisely the kind of asset that could be deployed against Spartan interests in the post-war settlement. Lysander was managing the new Spartan hegemony over Greece with the same careful strategic intelligence that had won him the war. Allowing Alcibiades to exist as a free agent in the Persian East was an ongoing risk with no obvious benefit. The request, in Plutarch's account, reached Pharnabazus. Alcibiades had been having dreams in this period. Plutarch records that he interpreted as warnings. Perhaps he had, or perhaps that detail belongs to the category of things that accounts of endings tend to acquire in the telling. The retrospective signs that seem obvious once the outcome is known. What we know is that the night came, and that it brought with it the one thing that all his intelligence and all his flexibility and all his extraordinary capacity for survival had never been designed to stop. Not a trial, not an exile, not another political reversal that created another opportunity for reinvention, just men with instructions, and a house in Phrygia, and the dark. Chapter 12. The Assassination. There are endings that arrive with the weight of inevitability, not because they were predetermined, not because the people involved had no choices left, but because the accumulation of everything that came before has created a situation where the ending feels, in retrospect, like the only thing that could have happened. A life lived at the extreme edge of what human intelligence and human ambition can produce, in a world that could neither fully contain nor fully ignore what that life represented, arrives eventually at a moment when the world simply decides it has had enough. The night of the assassination of Alcibiades is one of those endings. The exact date is uncertain. Ancient sources place it somewhere around 404 or 403 BC. In the final months of the Peloponnesian War, or its immediate aftermath, Plutarch is our most detailed source for the events of that night, drawing on earlier accounts that were themselves working from incomplete information about what happened in a house in Phrygia, far from the centres of Greek power, and far from the people who kept records. What Plutarch records is this: the men who came did not come openly. They did not arrest him. They did not bring a formal warrant or a legal instrument of any kind. They came at night, and their method was fire. They set the house alight. The choice of fire rather than direct assault tells us something about the men who had been sent and the instructions they had been given. They were not soldiers conducting an official execution. They were men tasked with producing a result quietly, in a way that could be attributed to accident or local violence, rather than to the specific decision of a specific powerful person. Fire is the weapon of people who want someone dead but do not want to stand too close to what they are doing. Alcibiades woke. He understood immediately what was happening. The smell of smoke, the sound of fire catching the wooden structure of the house, the particular quality of sudden danger that a man who had spent his entire adult life in environments where his survival was at risk would have recognized without needing to think about it. He did not try to escape through a window or a back exit. Plutarch records that he gathered whatever clothing was at hand, wrapped it around his left arm as a makeshift shield, picked up a sword, and walked directly toward the door. He came out into the night. What he walked into was a circle of armed men waiting at a distance from the house, far enough back to be safe from the fire, close enough to ensure that no one came out alive. They did not close with him directly. They were positioned to kill at a distance. Plutarch records that they threw their weapons rather than engaging him in the open. He was hit. He died in the open, outside the burning house, in the darkness of a Phrygian night, surrounded by men who had been paid to ensure that he did not survive to matter to anyone ever again. Timandra wrapped his body in her own clothing and gave him what burial she could manage in those circumstances. This detail, which Plutarch records without elaboration, is one of the most quietly devastating in the entire account. The man who had commanded fleets, who had been received by kings and satraps, who had walked into the Athenian assembly with the eyes of thousands upon him, whose beauty and intelligence and presence had reorganized every room he ever entered, was buried by a single woman in a foreign country with whatever cloth she had on her. Now, who gave the order? This is where the historical record requires honest handling. Plutarch attributes the assassination to Pharnabazus, acting on a request from the 30 tyrants in Athens, who were themselves responding to pressure from Lysander. The chain of causation he describes is politically coherent. The 30 wanted Alcibiades dead because he was a potential rallying point for democratic resistance. Lysander wanted him dead because he was a strategic liability in the post-war settlement. Pharnabazus had the practical means to arrange the killing, and sufficient reason to comply with a request from Sparta. Modern historians who have examined this question generally consider this account plausible in its broad outline, while noting that the specific details of who communicated what to whom cannot be verified from the surviving record. The chain of causation Plutarch describes is consistent with the political logic of the situation. It cannot be treated as documented fact in the same way that the Battle of Cyzicus or the fall of the 400 can be treated as documented fact. In Plutarch's account, Pharnabazus took it. There is one additional dimension that honest assessment requires. By the time of his death, Alcibiades had made himself genuinely threatening to an extraordinary number of powerful people. He had provided counsel to Sparta that had accelerated Athens' difficulties. He had manipulated Tissaphernes in ways that had damaged Persian credibility with both Greek powers. He had compromised the domestic situation of the Spartan king Agis in a way that carried specific weight in a culture where honour was a practical currency. He had created enemies across every major power in the Greek world and the Persian world adjacent to it. The question of who specifically gave the order matters less, in one sense, than the recognition that the order represented something close to a consensus that had been building for years. Almost everyone who mattered wanted him dead. The coordination required to act on that consensus was not extraordinary. It simply required that the various parties who shared the common interest be aware that they shared it, and that one of them be willing to take the practical step. There is a version of this story that treats the assassination as the final injustice in a life defined by injustice. That reading has genuine merit. Alcibiades had never received a fair trial for the original charges against him. He had been condemned in absentia on the basis of evidence that was politically motivated. The forces that killed him in Phrygia were not acting through law or justice, but through the same raw exercise of power that had driven him out of Athens in the first place. But honest assessment requires holding two things simultaneously. The injustice of how he was treated does not cancel the damage he caused. The damage he caused does not cancel the injustice of how he was treated. Both things are true. The men whose families had died in Sicily because Gylippus arrived on time had reason to want him dead. The democratic Athenians, persecuted by the 30, had reason to want him dead. The ordinary people on all sides who had paid the cost of a war that his choices had extended and intensified had reason to want him dead. He had made the world worse in specific and documented ways. He had also been treated unjustly in specific and documented ways. The assassination was both a crime, from the perspective of almost everyone involved, a solution. That is what makes it an ending rather than simply a crime. He left no children who appear in the historical record as significant figures. He left no school of thought, no political movement, no institutional legacy. What he left was the record. The speeches in Thucydides, the portrait in Plutarch, the character in Plato's Symposium, raising his cup and speaking with painful honesty about the one person who had made him feel ashamed of what he was and what he kept choosing. He was gone at approximately 45 or 46 years old. Athens would survive him, barely, in a form so diminished from what it had been when he was born that survival was almost indistinguishable from defeat. The specific question his life raised, the question of what happens when a city produces a person it cannot contain and cannot afford to lose, would not go away with him. It would travel forward, Embedded in the account that Thucydides had been constructing across the entire period, in the writing that Plutarch would later synthesize and amplify, finding its way eventually into the hands of people who had never heard of Athens and could not locate Phrygia on a map, still asking the same question. What do you do with the most dangerous person you have ever produced? Chapter 13. What Athens lost and what it never had. There is a particular kind of loss that a city experiences when it destroys something it cannot replace. Not the loss of a battle, which can be recovered from, not the loss of territory, which can sometimes be reclaimed, the loss of a possibility, the recognition, arriving too late to do anything about it, that what has been squandered was not simply a person, but a version of what the city itself could have been, if it had found a way to hold what it kept pushing away. Athens lost Alcibiades 3 times. The first time, it drove him out with a death sentence built on charges that were as much political calculation as genuine outrage. The second time, it removed him from command for a defeat that was not his fault, reversing within months a decision it had made with apparent conviction. The third time, it simply watched him disappear into the east, too broken by its own defeat to mount any further claim on a man it had already used up. Each loss was also a choice. That is the thing that this story will not let us ignore. No matter how sympathetically we approach either the city or the man, Athens was not simply the victim of Alcibiades' betrayals. It was the active producer of the conditions that made those betrayals possible, and in some cases likely, and in the end nearly inevitable. The assembly that refused him an immediate trial before the fleet sailed understood what it was doing. The politicians who let the panic over the Hermae do the work that evidence could not do understood what they were doing. The generals at Aegospotami, who dismissed his warning, understood that accepting his advice would cost them politically, which in Athens at that moment amounted to the same thing as understanding the choice. Athens chose, repeatedly and with full awareness of what it was choosing, the politics of fear over the honest use of its most capable citizen, and the war, with all its dead and all its suffering, was partly the price of those choices. Partly, not entirely, the honest assessment must hold the complexity. Alcibiades was not a victim. He was not a man who, with different treatment, would simply have been the great statesman his gifts promised and his city needed. He had genuine flaws that were as structural as his genuine gifts. And those flaws were not the product of Athens' mistreatment. They were the product of a character formed from childhood by a specific combination of extraordinary advantages and the near total absence of meaningful consequence for transgressing ordinary limits. He did not know how to be loyal to anything beyond himself. This is the honest judgment that the evidence of his entire career requires. Not that he was incapable of loyalty in the emotional sense. The speech in the Symposium contains something genuine, a painful, honest acknowledgement of what Socrates had meant to him and what he had failed to do with it. But loyalty as a political and moral commitment, the willingness to subordinate personal advantage to a larger obligation even when the personal cost is real. This was something he demonstrated almost no capacity for across his entire life. He went to Sparta when Athens exiled him. He betrayed Sparta when Sparta became dangerous. He manipulated Persia when Persia was useful. He returned to Athens when Athens seemed like the best available option. Each move was rational from the perspective of his personal survival, None was the action of a person with a genuine commitment to anything beyond that survival. Socrates had seen this. He had seen it from the beginning, and had spent years trying to address it through the one method he believed could reach it: genuine self-examination. The kind of honest internal accounting that requires a person to look at the gap between what they are and what they could be. Not to feel good about the gap, but to feel the weight of it, to allow that weight to produce the moral seriousness that turns intelligence into wisdom. Alcibiades had stood at the threshold of that examination more times than most people ever get to. He had felt the weight. He had acknowledged it. In the Symposium, with an honesty that was itself a form of the self-knowledge Socrates was trying to cultivate. And then he had walked away. Every time. He walked away when Athens was giving him everything. He walked away when he was on the deck of his flagship with the largest fleet the city had ever assembled behind him. He walked away when the assembly welcomed him back with tears. And he walked away from the generals at Aegospotami who would not listen, understanding with perfect clarity what his absence would cost them. Always walking away. Always toward the next position, the next calculation, the next version of survival. Never toward the thing Socrates had been pointing at. The connection between his story and the trial of Socrates deserves direct attention because it is one of the most important threads running through everything we have examined. When Socrates was put on trial in 399 BC, 4 years after the fall of Athens, one of the charges was that he had corrupted the youth of the city. The accusers did not need to name specific names. Many in the room would have known which former students the charge could evoke. The most spectacular apparent failure of Socratic education that Athens could point to was Alcibiades. The most brilliant student the philosopher had ever taught was also the man whose career had demonstrated in the most visible possible way what happened when extraordinary intelligence was developed without the ethical framework that Socrates kept insisting was the only thing that made intelligence genuinely useful. The charge was deeply unfair to Socrates in its specific legal form. He had not taught Alcibiades to betray Athens. He had spent years trying to teach him the opposite. But the charge pointed at something real. Socrates had failed with Alcibiades. The failure was not a failure of effort or intelligence or genuine care. It was a failure that illuminated something important about the limits of what philosophy can accomplish when the person it is trying to reach has decided, at a level deeper than argument can access, that the examined life costs more than they are willing to pay. The trial of Socrates was not caused by the career of Alcibiades. Historians who have examined the period carefully point to multiple factors behind the prosecution, including the political atmosphere of the restored democracy, specific grievances of the accusers, and the broader anxieties of a city trying to understand what had gone wrong. Alcibiades was one element in a complex picture, not a single cause. What is accurate is that his existence as Socrates' most famous former student created an association that the accusers could exploit, that his career became part of the atmosphere that made Socrates vulnerable, and that the philosopher who had tried harder than anyone to reach him paid a significant price for the attempt. The deepest question the relationship raises is one that has no clean answer. Is it possible to educate genuine moral character in someone who has been formed by circumstances that make moral seriousness strategically unnecessary? Can philosophy reach a person who has been told by every experience of their life that the rules governing other people do not apply to them? Socrates believed it was possible. he acted on that belief until the hemlock, continuing to ask questions and expose assumptions and point toward the examined life even after his most famous student had demonstrated what happened when the pointing was not enough. We do not know if he was right in principle. We know he was wrong in the specific case. There is another dimension of what Athens lost that goes beyond the personal and reaches into the structural. Alcibiades represented a specific challenge that democratic systems face whenever they produce individuals whose gifts significantly exceed the system's capacity to integrate them through its ordinary mechanisms. Democracy, as the Athenians practiced it, was designed to manage the collective judgment of ordinary citizens. It had developed institutions to prevent the concentration of power, to distribute authority, to ensure that no single individual could dominate decision-making indefinitely. Ostracism was one such institution. The annual rotation of offices was another. These institutions worked reasonably well for managing the ordinary range of human ambition and capability. They were not designed for Alcibiades. His gifts exceeded the ordinary range in ways that the institutional constraints could not quite contain. He could charm the institutions as he charmed everything else. He was, in the most precise sense, too much for the system, and the system, lacking any mechanism for genuinely integrating what was too much for it, oscillated between celebrating him and destroying him, between using everything he had to offer and then panicking about what it had used. This oscillation was not irrational. It was the rational response of a system to something it could not process. The problem was that the rational response of the system produced irrational outcomes. Each decision that felt sensible in the moment of fear made the overall situation significantly worse. The lesson is not that democracies should simply trust their most gifted citizens regardless of what those citizens do. The lesson is something harder and more specific. Institutions that cannot develop honest mechanisms for integrating exceptional individuals will be damaged by those individuals in one of two ways. Either the exceptional individual operates without accountability, using the system's inability to contain them to accumulate unchecked power, or the system destroys the exceptional individual through the mechanisms of fear and majority rule, losing whatever genuine value those gifts represented, and often triggering exactly the damaging response from the expelled person that the expulsion was designed to prevent. Athens experienced both failure modes with Alcibiades. The unchecked accumulation of influence before the Sicilian Expedition, the destructive expulsion that converted his gifts into weapons pointed in the wrong direction. A wiser Athens would have found a third way. We do not know what that third way would have looked like. Because Athens did not find it, what we can say is that the question the relationship between Athens and Alcibiades raises is not purely historical. Every complex institution that produces exceptional individuals, every organization that creates people whose abilities exceed the ordinary mechanisms of accountability, faces some version of the same challenge. How do you hold what you cannot fully contain? How do you use what is genuinely extraordinary without being used by it in return? How do you maintain the integrity of the system while making room for the person whose gifts the system cannot quite account for? These are not questions with permanent answers. They are questions each generation has to answer for itself, in the specific institutional contexts it inhabits, with the specific exceptional individuals it produces. Athens answered them badly. Thucydides, who had known Alcibiades, who had served as an Athenian general in the same war, and had been exiled himself by Athens for a military failure, who had spent years constructing the most rigorous account of political and military decision-making that antiquity produced, offered his own assessment, drawing on what his text conveys rather than reproducing it directly. He wrote that the Athenians could never quite decide whether Alcibiades was an asset or a threat, that they celebrated his qualities and feared his ambitions simultaneously, that this indecision, as much as anything else, contributed to what followed. Thucydides understood that the story of Alcibiades was not primarily a story about one man. It was a story about a city that could not make up its mind, and the city that cannot make up its mind about its most gifted and most dangerous citizen does not get to keep either the gift or the danger. It gets the consequences of both, without the benefit of either. Athens got exactly that. The walls came down. The democracy was suspended. The long war that had begun when Alcibiades was a child watching Pericles build the Parthenon ended with the city that had built the Parthenon accepting terms from the city that had never understood why anyone would want to. Socrates was tried and executed 4 years later. The philosopher who had tried to give Alcibiades the one thing that might have made the difference was killed by the same democratic machinery that had destroyed everything else it had touched in those final years. Plato watched all of it. A young aristocrat who had expected to enter public life and instead found himself watching his teacher die for the crime of asking questions. Questions that had been sharpened, at least in part, by decades of trying to reach one student who kept walking away. Plato spent the rest of his life asking what justice was. The question that came out of watching Socrates die was also the question that came out of watching what Athens had done with Alcibiades. If a city can produce the most brilliant mind of its generation and then execute it for asking questions, and can produce one of the most gifted strategic intelligences of its generation and drive it into the arms of its enemies, what does justice mean? What does it mean for a community to be organized well? What does wisdom look like when it is actually applied to the way human beings arrange their collective life? These questions came out of the 5th century in Athens, out of the war and the plague and the factional violence and the spectacular gifts and the spectacular failures, out of the specific story of a man who had everything and used it to produce, in the end, almost nothing of permanent value beyond the record of what he was and what his city did with him, and what both of them cost each other. Alcibiades did not answer these questions. He was the reason they had to be asked. That is not nothing. In a world full of people who live their entire lives without forcing any question of permanent importance into view, the person whose existence makes the important questions unavoidable has done something that matters, even if what they have done is to demonstrate, with a clarity that cannot be ignored, exactly how not to live. The house in Phrygia has been gone for more than 2,000 years. The burning is long finished. The archers in the darkness are dust. Timandra, who wrapped a body in cloth because there was nothing else available, is a name in Plutarch and nothing else. But the questions are still here. What do you do with the most dangerous person you have ever produced? What do you owe the person whose gifts you used without ever finding a way to honestly account for the cost? How does a city hold what it cannot fully contain without being destroyed by what it cannot bring itself to let go? Athens did not answer them. We have not answered them either. But we are still asking, and the asking, which began in the agora of a city that has been rubble for 2,000 years, in the questions of a philosopher who was killed for asking them, in the career of a man who was beautiful and brilliant and destructive, and finally alone in a burning house in a country that was not his own, is still the most honest thing we do. Let the world outside stay quiet a little longer. The most beautiful, perhaps the most dangerous man in Athens has told us everything we need to know about what happens when a city and a person cannot find a way to be honest with each other. The rest is up to us.